Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About HR, a weekly podcast where we explore the forces shaping our roles today, from new technologies, shifting expectations to tightening budgets. I'm your host, Felix Mitchell. Now, before we get going with the show, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Pinpoint, for making this episode possible. Pinpoint, in my opinion, is a fantastic applicant tracking system. We use them across a number of our clients at Instant Impact. Absolutely love their functionality. They've got some really cool features around anonymizing applications in particular, fantastic reporting suite, and a really smart and exciting product roadmap as well. I think they've really got their heads screwed on tight. Whether you're a small company or a larger company looking for a really modern ATS, I definitely recommend you give them a call. Just go to pinpointhq.com and specify that you heard about them through We Need to Talk About HR. You'll get a Friends of the Podcast discount. How cool is that? Now, on with the show. One of the most important accountabilities of a modern people function is to be the guardian of the employee experience. From the first time a potential hire hears about a company to their retirement party. Why then is it that the HR status quo is so outdated? And why do we still rely on paradigms that were created 70 years ago in a largely industrialized workforce? Those are the questions that we're digging into on today's episode. I'm joined by Francis Lake, the founder and CEO of Green Juniper, a people advisory business founded to make work brilliant. If you walk down any high street in the UK, you will come across people who have benefited from Francis's hard work. He's held people leadership positions at Halifax, Lloyds Banking Group, Clydesdale Yorkshire Bank, and his last big corporate role was as head of organizational development at Virgin Money. Personally, I haven't met many HR leaders who think so creatively about how to solve big commercial challenges. And so I'm really, really looking forward to having you on the show today, Francis. Welcome.
Thanks, Felix. Wow. And thank you for the intro. That was really nice.
Absolutely. So I gave a few of the, headlines there, but how did you end up in HR?
Kind of a long story. I spent some time teaching in Sri Lanka after university, and I liked that aspect of helping people learn and grow. But I knew I didn't want to be a teacher coming back into the UK. So I sort of found my way into what was then a kind of graduate scheme and learned about this thing of training in companies. So I got interested in training and then kind of realized quite quickly that through training, you didn't actually affect any change really. And so actually there's more of the HR practice. The things that went on outside the training was what started to change. So almost each step I was kind of doing this thing of finding you could have the knowledge or the expertise, but what really mattered was did you have the access to people in order to help them change? And that sort of worked my way into HR. And then over time, I guess kind of gathering, you sort of see that different parts of HR, they're all part of the system. So you could pull one, like you could pull the training lever, or you could have great recruitment. If you have great recruitment, then induction falls over. It doesn't work. So having to try and look at the whole system of HR, that's where I started to get more and more interested. And it's probably a bit of a magpie of collecting HR experience, I guess.
That's really interesting. And obviously you've been a practitioner in organizations for a while. Why did you take the step into advisory?
I think there's a couple of things really. I think one of the big things was I found more and more that I was actually talking to companies and almost like giving advice or opinion while being in-house. We did a lot of really progressive work at particularly sort of CYBG Virgin Money, and really worked hard to try and solve kind of organizational problems properly. So we was getting into talking to organizations about that, and then I was finding more and more that was the piece that I really liked, and that I guess a bit like how I got into HR. That how could I maximize my ability to influence things for the better, and felt I could do that more by working with more organizations rather than sort of being in-house in one, I guess.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess having that breadth of impact.
Yeah. And one of the things I love is how different organizational context is. So more and more, I think that context is such a big part of it. And so being able to take sort of principles or practices that I firmly believe can make work better, but then looking at how that might work in, whether it's like, cruise lines or charities or a ballet company or, whatever it may be, looking at the really different context is that I just love that, to be honest, in a quite selfish way.
That's interesting. So does context then, does that change the route to get to the same endpoint, or does it change the endpoint as well?
Gosh, I think both. I'm challenging myself now, and having said that, I think it definitely changes the route through, because people are starting in different places, whether it is their level of the way they think about their work, the level of relationships in them, the nature of them, their engagement with the purpose of the organization. All of that, I think, affects the way people feel, and the way people feel affects how they work. And then on the side of, does it impact the solution? I guess if you took it at a real macro level, my aim is always create things where people are better at work because they enjoy work better, they work better together, they're more engaged, they understand what they're doing, they've got the skills, so that you get a really complementary solution of it's good for people, it's good for individuals, it's good for teams, it's good for the organization. So that's always the end point. But I think the balance of, whether it's the processes or the practices or all of those will change, I think. Which in one way is doing an advisory role just makes work harder because you're bespoking it every time rather than rolling something off the shelf.
Also makes it easier for them. It makes it harder for companies just to Google the answer.
Yeah, yes.
At least
that's true.
At least you're in a space where there's genuine expertise required. I think otherwise you got to, with AI and all the rest of it, then you're really in trouble.
God,
I think one of these ways that, in our conversations when we were preparing for today, we were really talking about how those sorts of methodologies that HR practitioners and use to support the businesses that they work within and the ways that businesses are structured, they almost feel like they're sort of transitioning into a new mold. And you used a term which has really been ringing in my head, which is, I suppose, the meat of what we're looking to get into today, which is human-centric productivity.
Yeah, okay.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think there's one of the things I find really interesting is organizations often say our people are our greatest asset. It's one of those kind of classic lines. But if you think about where they appear in budgets is as a cost line. So there's almost that economic view of one person equals one unit of productivity. And that kind of paradigm is sort of stuck there forever. And even in roles where it's potentially widgets on a production line and you can go, did so-and-so make 18 or did they make 19 or did they make 20? Will and human choice will affect whether, if I do not want to put in the extra effort, then I've got 18 widgets instead of 20.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes, more and more of us are knowledge workers. And so we are reliant on people's brains working well, that they are thinking at their best and their freest, that they are the most creative, the most productive, the most receptive to ideas, the most able to engage with others. And you can't get into that by process, structure, control. There has to be a balance of a real focus on how do you get the individuals feeling at their at their best. Because if they feel at their best, you've got the best chance of them working well. So it's that starting with a focus on, for this human being, how do we what do we need to put in place to give them the best chance of really operating at their best? And one of the great ironies in a way was in COVID, there was a time when we were all particularly in lockdown, when there was far more, the distance between work and the rest of your life was the door of your study, bedroom, wherever you happen to be working.
Yeah, if you had a study or a spare bedroom, otherwise you're in the kitchen.
yeah, absolutely. And so you'd see all the time the Amazon delivery or arms appearing out of nowhere with mugs of tea. All of that, and we became, for a while, we were far more appreciative of that work as an aspect of life and looked at it as a whole. And then I think we've quite forgotten a lot of that and almost got back into an attempt to process control and so on. And I think there's real lessons from that COVID time of that we, in the absolute biggest crisis that we faced, we trusted people to go home and continue to be productive and sort themselves out, and they stepped up. So how do you sustain some of those things of the kind of level of trust, the level of attention, the level of care, and the level of acceptance that people can work it out for themselves? So that's, I guess, the really human-centric piece of it.
I wonder why we've lost so much trust since COVID.
Yeah. I think there's this incredible thing, isn't it, where we started off, in the early days, and we were applauding for the NHS and that kind of thing. And almost there's this lesson that it got to this resentment of rules to the point where it almost turned into a mistrust of authority. And then the response turned into a mistrust of authority. So our response is, we're going to add more rules, we're going to have more processes, we're going to tell you the answer is 3 days a week in the office or whatever. So there's, and I honestly think a lot of it is a lack of capacity to stop, to properly slow down, look at it, learn, and think, how do we reset? It was much more almost, if people had a 3-year strategy rather than go, we had 2 years where the whole world's gone to hell, maybe we need to rethink. It's like, how quickly can we get back to the trajectory we were on?
This is where we were in 2019.
Exactly.
Let's pick up.
Yeah. Just pretend, it's like the thing in the Marvel films, the blip, and then everyone's reappeared and we just carry on. Life's not like that.
It's a really interesting challenge. And there's a great book, which if you haven't read, you have to. I'm sure you have, though. If you had No Rules.
No.
You're going to be a huge fan. So it's written by a journalist who's interviewing the CEO and founder of Netflix.
Okay.
And the whole concept, a big piece of the concept behind it is, first of all, do everything you can to create a talent-dense organization where you've got amazing people in, absolute top of their game, pay them top of market rate, whatever it is. And it's all based because in a knowledge economy, the difference between a 10 out of 10 performer and a 9 out of 10 performer in their output is much, much greater than 1 point out of 10, even though it's 1 point in the skills and the same in the salary. The other point is, once you've got those people, remove rules because you hired them for a reason.
Yeah.
And if you've hired people of that caliber, you should be able to expect them to drive their own expectations and come up with their own route forward and take the holiday that they need to get their job done. And if they stop performing, then you find someone else who will. And it's a fantastic book. It's definitely how I think about building, the business that I work in, Instant Impact. But it's interesting how these rules and processes are sometimes, they have the opposite effect than you expect them to have. And how does that show itself in an HR context?
And it's one of the things I love that, the Netflix thing. I love the piece where they sort of talk about, again, you need to effectively grow talent density faster than you grow bureaucracy. And I love that sort of that kind of piece. And their culture deck, I think, is still fantastic. Yeah. I think with HR, a lot of the challenges as a profession, we kind of measure things in much too small a way. And so recruitment's a great example where we will look at how do you make the recruitment process efficient? So how do you use as little time of managers as possible? And so that might, in the course of a selection process, maybe saves 10 hours. However, if that gets you an 8 out of 10 candidate, or you've just missed finding the 9 out of 10 candidates because your search has been too narrow, or you've had an automated sift that's looked at the wrong characteristics, or whatever it may be. So you get the bum on the seat. But if that person is slower to get up to speed, or they're a poor cultural fit, or they are unhappy because they've realised they've joined the wrong organisation,
or they're a bully and they make everyone else unhappy.
Absolutely, yeah. All of those things aren't factored in. All we've looked at is we've saved 6 hours here. 6 hours in process. It doesn't take long if you have a bully for there to be more than 6 hours of management and team time taken up. So and you kind of see that almost on every aspect of people practice. It's what we kind of measure is almost process completion and efficiency, rather than is this practice going to generate kind of long-term sustainable performance from most people? And it's such a different lens of looking at things. And for a while, historically, I think that it was more okay. Now, because we have systems for most things, the data we have access to is huge. Our ability in HR to actually measure what we've always said was not measurable is fantastic now. So we can see, are we creating long-term value? We can measure it, and we can demonstrate it to our colleagues around executive tables or so on.
You know what the real gauntlet to throw down is, Francis? The gauntlet is, how do we prove that the people strategies, the recruitment strategies, the HR strategies, all the rest of it, are directly responsible for the revenue and profit of the organization? Because it has to be true.
Yes. Yeah.
But we're missing the equation.
Yeah. Yes. And there's one of the things that really struck me on this, where there's always this great thing where on lots of financial statements, there's a line that will say other adjustments, which is the bit where the finance guys haven't balanced the books. And so there's a line where they balance it, or there's all sorts of, or in any business case for any project, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that gets written in there. Or net promoter score is whether marketing is effective is kind of made up as a method in a way. And like you said, that I think is something we haven't worked hard enough at within HR, I think, to do. That said, there are things where kind of previous role we were getting much, much better at looking at, could we identify where managers were creating the right environment and creating the right outcomes? And one of the pieces of work we did in there was looking at 5 fairly simple performance practices, correlate those with a whole bunch of scores from the colleague survey, which some were straightforward engagement, satisfaction with performance, but others were, do I understand strategy? Do I advocate company products? Some measures that were business outcomes. And what we were finding was managers who did none of the 5 management practices, their average across these scores was 50%. I think one, it rose to 65, and then it was broadly a straight line. So 80% for managers who did all 5. So you can see a direct correlation between simple management practice and colleagues who knew, at very least, knew what they were supposed to be doing and wanted to do it. And the example we then said was, if you imagine, a hockey team or a football team, or whatever, you imagine teams of players. One team has 5 out of their 10 players who know what they're doing, know where they should be on the field, and know who they're passing to. And the other one has 8 out of 10. One of those teams is going to be successful every single time. And it's that kind of straightforward. You've got 3 more in every 10 people who knows what they're doing. It's an incredible. I'm sort of drifting a bit. Let me do that. So there's this. What it starts to show us, I think, is that you can, by combining the right measures, really identify that there is a direct correlation between the right people in interventions and then the right outputs. But it requires a bit broader thinking, more connected, and more long-term, really, as well.
It's really interesting. Let me have a think about that management piece, because I'm fascinated by the role of the manager, particularly by how little structure we put around management, how few managers are trained, how many people leave their jobs because they hate their managers, how many people stay in their jobs because they love their managers. So it's really, it feels like one of those big pieces of value just waiting to get unlocked. So one of the bits I'm just going to query you on, because I don't think I fully understood it. So I think we're saying, as much as you can, you should really be removing structure and processes from the case. And yet we've said, here are some 5 structure processes, management processes to follow. So where is it important to have a process and a way of doing things? And where is it important to strip that out?
Yeah. So I think how best to describe? So I guess if you were to take that example of performance, where we got to, so it's things like, in this team, do you talk about well-being in the team? Do people have team goals? Do they have individual development goals? Do they give feedback? Do they receive feedback? So how we do that, how structured that was, loads of choice, and fit to your context, fit to the team, and so on. But those simple things of the way I have often described it is you kind of, as HR, you sort of draw the lines of the playground, and then how people play in it is up to them. And the lines of and you might give them advice. You might help them on doing things better. You might show them that people who do these things are more effective. But you try not to be too prescriptive. I think the other challenge, and this is one of the biggies, is if you take Netflix or Google and a real similar kind of focus on brilliant recruitment, and then the rest takes care of itself sort of thing. Those guys are really able to hire phenomenal people consistently. Whereas for most organizations, you've got this sort of mix of ability, tenure, care, enthusiasm. Someone said earned cynicism, like that kind of, and so with that, you're kind of trying to raise and level out standards. And I think that's where the sort of lack of attention over a long period has a big impact.
I think it's really interesting, and it goes back to, I'm going to self-plug an episode here, which was I had a guest on, Peter Phelan, who we really talked around the importance of values in an organization. I think that's broadly what you're talking about, which is, his point was, if you set out the values and you live the values, you know that work is going to get done a certain way, even if there's no script or written process for it. You know that this is the instant impact way of delivering outsourced recruitment. This is what happens, and here are the standards, and this is the sort of innovation we expect. You don't need to write the playbook for everything.
Yes,
and I think that's
I think that's very much you talk about the kind of outcomes that people are wanting to achieve. This sort of management philosophy. I often describe it as, if you act with positive intent, and if you assume positive intent, life and work gets much better and much easier. Because I fundamentally believe that the vast, vast majority of people are trying to do the right thing. The challenge we have in particularly the bigger organizations is you get siloed and siloed and siloed in the goals to the point when people are trying to do different right things, but they're all acting in what they're trying to do what they think is the right thing. So it's finding those points of connection that, and that's actually one of the reasons why managers are so important, because they are the people who have more connection across the organization.
And they can readjust people early on and make sure that they're pointing in the right direction.
Yeah. Also, there's a really important piece, actually. I think in more than ever, managers are absolutely critical, and more than ever, that job has become more challenging. So if I kind of think there was something like something like a 3 million person swing in the workforce from pre-COVID to now.
Wow.
So you kind of think is the people who are entering the workforce, that's a big change. So that kind of element. We now expect managers to care not just about the work you do, but actually where you do it and when you do it, because having to manage hybrid. Much more attention to well-being than there was before, and particularly an understanding of mental well-being, where I suspect there's been a long period of mental illness treated as performance issues in a way that we want with physical issues. Also in that period of COVID was murder of George Floyd, and there's a shift in thinking, awareness and requirement around what creating an inclusive and equitable environment really meant. All of those huge changes for managers in kind of thinking and practice, and they had no capacity, no either mental, physical or time capacity to take those on. And at that same period as well, lots more kind of, because we were working more closely in teams, the small unit of work becomes more important. So the trust with the manager is even tighter. So you've got this kind of thing of people rely on managers more, the importance of the role is even greater, and not really given any more support. So I think a lot is just investing in really, really helping managers is probably the best thing we could do in work. Full stop.
I really agree with you. I think it's one of the most impactful things that business leaders and HR professionals can do, is to really focus in on the sort of love the middle manager.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? And that there's so. Sorry, let me do that. And for those managers, I think one of the great challenges is the role models you've had or learned from are a different generation to lots of the people who are now working. And I've never been a fan of this sort of generation, 4 generations in work. I've always thought it's a bit simplistic. But there are things now where the experience of people entering work is really quite different. I think we talked about this in the prep thing, but if you were, for people who have, say, if they went to schools, for people who went to school, left school, went straight to university, completed a 3-year degree and have just entered the workplace this autumn, they finished school in lockdown, so may well not have done exams. They then finished their degree during a strike by examiners. So potentially even now haven't got a graded exam. So they don't know whether they're any good at lots of the things that we use to measure whether people are good. And so,
if those were accurate measures,
yeah, totally, yes, totally, yeah. But there's that, and so then if they go into a profession and suddenly they're doing professional qualifications, they're far less prepared for those kind of things than people who just happen to be 18 months older than them or 18 months younger than them. And so there's this really kind of peculiar situation that I think we need to be much more attentive to, where our preference is to go, COVID's in the rearview mirror and let's forget about it. The long-term impacts on work, I think, are going to run for years.
Forget the long-term impacts on work. I think we haven't even scratched the surface on the long-term impact on people's mental development, on how that's going to impact how they interact with society as general. I mean, imagine going through puberty at home, stuck with your parents for 2 years, right? Not really learning, not really in that sort of playground environment where school is hard, but if you're there in person, it shapes you in a lot of ways. And I think I had conversations, just about anecdotal conversations with a friend of mine who's a psychologist. She was saying how deep the impact has been on people of different ages in different ways of COVID. And that's going to be something that...
Yeah, that's fascinating. I read an amazing book called The Psychology of Pandemics, which was astonishing. It's by a Canadian academic, and it was published in November 2019.
No way.
It was like amazing. And kind of got into a lot of so it looked at avian flu, lots of historic things. And it was kind of incredible. I think I read it in something like May 2020, and you were starting to go, oh yeah, we could have that. If only anybody had read this book in March 2020. But that kind of piece of the long-term mental health impact of pandemics was huge. And all of his examples were things that had been shorter or more localized rather than this huge kind of shift. And I think, so I don't want to get too COVID-y, but I think the really important thing is that people's experiences entering work and forming work, that we need to be able to think about what that experience is like and what their expectations are like and what their experience of work is, in a way that previously you'd almost go, it's just a small incremental, it's an incremental change year on year on year. That's been a fracture point, and that's all entering our workforce now.
It's really interesting. I also don't like this generational thought because I think it's lazy, but I do think there are some truths to it that are important to bear in mind. And I've been reading these articles recently, which are really fascinating, about that for the first time in people under 30, the political leanings of men and women are diverging.
Wow.
So young women tend to be more liberal and left wing, and young men are tending towards more right wing. And it's really happening it's the first time since they've started recording these things that they've seen it in Western countries, and it's happening across the world, US, UK. And it's so interesting how we're going to have to start taking gender perspectives into account as well when it comes to sort of preferences on working style and things like that.
And any sense of causation? Why? Or is it too early?
Everyone's pointing the finger at TikTok generation, Andrew Tate and his nonsense he's peddling. And I think there's definitely it's interesting when you compare I'm not a big Instagrammer, but I do have the app. You compare my Instagram reel to my wife's. I mean, my wife's is all babies, people's fashion photos, and mine is, I haven't done anything to deserve this. It's all Andrew Tate. I get a lot of Russian propaganda, like really pro-Putin. I got no idea where all of this comes from.
Gosh.
But you believe what it's sort of, you are what you eat, right? But you are what you scroll.
That is amazing, isn't it? I did an experiment a little while ago from I forgot the guy's name. The Stolen Focus. Johan Harry. And the whole thing is kind of about the impact of social media, but in the round, the kind of the way algorithms feed and how it sort of feeds. And so I started doing this experiment of declining all cookies, which for a while was okay. And then what actually ended up was, because it was far harder for any social media to predict my interests. So my feed was just all adverts.
Really?
Because it was almost like, it felt like I was now being bombarded with attempts to understand my interest, and come hell or high water, they were going to find. It was just really quite a strange experience. So that's probably quite a tangent again, isn't it?
But that's fine. That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
So I am keen to get onto one other point around HR, which is a bit of a hot topic at the moment, but performance management.
Yes.
I know this is a real passion of yours.
Yeah.
So how do you think it needs to change?
Yeah. So and I think we touched on this before, and you touched on it in the introduction, where there are the annual performance cycle is, I think it's like a function of military promotion cycles pre-Second World War, which bears no resemblance to the way we work today. So a thing that sort of works on the premise that work is planned at the start of the year and goals are set, and then those goals remain relevant 12 months further down the line. And in fact, even that they can be articulated accurately enough for knowledge workers is kind of crazy. The notion that in any rating scale, there's still the sort of thing of we'll have a normal distribution. There's no rationale for that. There's no statistical basis for that. Because in any organization, people are doing different jobs, they've got different abilities. You're not comparing like with like at all. But what you are doing with that is immediately telling a large group of people that they're below average, which is not motivational in any way sense. So it doesn't support things like creating an environment of psychological safety. It doesn't put people in a state when they feel they're going to get at their best. It puts colleagues in conflict because they know only one of us is going to get the top rating, or the lines of someone's going to take it for the team. Managers and colleagues can build a relationship of trust through 364 days of the year and break it in one annual appraisal so easily. So there's all of these kind of things. And the other thing, we talked about values earlier, and so many organizations will have a value of teamwork or collaboration or so on. But most performance management has no element of that whatsoever. It kind of goes, we'll cascade goals down and break them in smaller and smaller chunks until you and I could be teammates, sat next to each other on a bank of desks every day of the year and not know what each other's priorities are. We'd never see each other's goals. So there's this. So that's just creating barriers between us collaborating, even as teammates. So the whole thing on performance, where I kind of think is one is an element of make it reflect the flow of work. So make it timely enough that and short term enough that people feel the pressure to get going, to get on with it, and they know what they're doing, and then you update it as the next pieces become kind of clear. If the goals are far enough off that people can postpone them, then anyone who's pressure prompted like me is going to postpone them. So have the kind of timeline timely enough. Make sure there's an understanding across teams. So one of the things I like a lot is having team goals rather than individual goals. And then individuals think about what's my contribution to that. So there's that kind of element. Much, much more frequent conversations about how things are going and updating them rather than a sort of annual kind of thing. And the other piece that increasingly I've looked to build in is consideration of well-being, and the rationale for that is if you don't have well-being, you have no performance. If people are tired, burnt out, sick, they are not performing. And it's not just them, because you're always in a chain. You're always in a chain of people. People handing work off to you, you're handing it off to others. So if somebody's not actually able to operate very well because they're just not feeling good. That the ripples of that are pretty huge. So being able to pay attention to making sure people do have well-being, it's just fueling the tank.
Yeah.
I think that also becomes an element of and a worthy element to discuss in performance conversations. So yeah, very much reflect the flow of work, get teams operating together, and give people more say in what they're working on, rather than assuming they kind of cascade down.
And so practically then, are we talking, let's say you're in a sort of HR manager role, right? It's quite project based, but there's also that sort of BAU you've got to sort of sustain. So you saying at the beginning of each project, you're saying, actually, this is what we're going to be, this is how I'm going to rank your performance. And it's sort of iterative and sort of cumulative over the...
Yeah. So I wouldn't rank colleagues against each other. And if you can possibly avoid it, because I think there's just too many factors.
I agree.
What I think, the way I kind of think of it is this individual worth the salary we're paying for them? In which case, that's a solid investment. Are they getting better? And if they are, then that's great. It doesn't matter whether they're better or worse than the next person. What you start to get interested then is what's the rate of their improvement, and you flip the focus to how do I help the individual get better faster. Rather than is colleague A better than colleague B, when you can't really compare effectively. It feels to me like a red herring. We do it all the time, but it's I've sat in far more roundtable conversations than I choose to remember. I don't think I've ever been in one where a management team has come out as a stronger team at the end of the conversation, but I've come out of plenty where the management team has been a weaker team. And I can't think of any where all colleagues had a fair and equitable hearing. But I can think of plenty where they haven't.
Yeah, roundtables around promotions.
Yes, right. Yeah, promotions, talent assessment, performance assessment, reward assessment, anything. Yeah, anything where assessing the whole population to rank in some way or other.
It's really tough, isn't it? And it creates that adrenaline fight or flight amongst everyone. It makes people, it breaks down relationships. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that's so important. Anyway, Francis, we are timed out. So I'm just going to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a really, really, really interesting conversation.
I've loved it. Thank you. Thanks so much, Felix. Yeah, brilliant.